Hey everybody, Dr. Leith here. I'm recording for Diagnosis. I apologize if the last video was a little choppy. I played around with some settings on my computer, so hopefully we'll have a smoother video this time. And I got a different microphone, so hopefully the audio is a little more clear. I'm going over Diagnosis tonight. And so this is information that I would typically cover over the course of 2 weeks in the long semesters. Obviously, this is the summer semester, and then made further complicated by us being entirely online. I'm going to go over two PowerPoints that I combined into one. Nothing on these slides is different from what is already posted on Blackboard. The only thing that I've done is I changed like the design so it looked a little bit nicer since we'll be looking at it for a little bit. But otherwise, it's the same information. And really what I wanted to go over tonight is why we diagnose and how we go about making a diagnosis, because you have a tremendous amount of power by being able to diagnose people, and with that comes a lot of things that one should consider, right? So a lot of times what happens is people enroll in this class and I'll get questions like, well, what if I don't want to diagnose, or I don't think every problem requires a diagnosis, and both of those are really valid points. Addressing the second one first, no, not everybody you see that comes into counseling is going to have a diagnosis, and so we should refrain from giving a diagnosis if there isn't one. That's completely okay, and that is the ethical thing to do. The other point about why I don't want to diagnose, well, there's a lot of clinicians who don't want to diagnose, and they don't. For any number of reasons, you can refrain from giving a diagnosis that you don't feel is needed. Now, if you work for managed care, you're accepting insurance, that's where the rub is. They're going to want a diagnosis, and the way that clinicians work with that is by not accepting insurance, right? They only do private pay, and that gives you the ability to not give a diagnosis. So you have a couple things to consider. However, a really important thing to remember, something that I think we can all agree on, is that mental illness does exist, right? Diagnoses do exist. So it's unfair to say that all diagnoses are wrong and that we're going to throw out the entire system with it. These are things to consider, and diagnosis serves its purpose, namely to identify a set of criteria, a set of symptoms, and to help your client figure out what's going on, to find an appropriate treatment plan and appropriate interventions. And in the case of using managed care, it helps that client access services and also helps with referral services. So although I agree, don't rush to diagnose, don't force a diagnosis, certainly. Diagnosis has a purpose, and we also don't want to misdiagnose or underdiagnose, right? Not giving a diagnosis when one should be given. So those are things to think about, but certainly the expectation is not that as soon as you start seeing clients, you're going to start diagnosing them. It won't seem this way throughout the course of the semester because of the nature of the course. It's a diagnosis course, so we're going to be, eyeballs deep in diagnoses and criteria and things like that. I'm actually a really conservative diagnostician, right? I don't give diagnoses easily. It's a lot of times the people I work with, it's phase of life stuff. They're adjusting to changes in their life. And if I were to just shoot from the hip and diagnose, I would wind up diagnosing everybody with depression and anxiety and obsessive compulsive. But that's not the case. So it won't seem this way throughout the course of the semester because I'm going to be pulling from really extreme examples of the behavior to make points, like to get my point across. But certainly please don't take that as me suggesting anytime you see someone who cries a lot, it's depression, or anytime someone says, I can't stop thinking about my ex, then it must be obsessive compulsive, or even when people do sort of not nice things, that's certainly not, a personality issue. There's lots of reasons. So although we'll be going over these things in depth, you can absolutely, and I encourage you to take your time when you're working with clients to not rush to a diagnosis. So with that, let me switch gears to this PowerPoint, and they'll be attached with the video. So let's get familiar a little bit with the DSM. We are on the 5th edition, which came out in 2013. So comparatively to the previous editions, it's still newer. It's obviously the newest one, but it's also still young compared to the other ones. And so that's why I said at the beginning of the semester, you have to have the 5th edition, right? It would be useless to have the 4th edition and quite a bit unethical to have it. So the DSM has all your different disorders in it, right? If it's in there, it's diagnosable. If it's not in there, it's not diagnosable. It is ICD-10 compatible, meaning that it matches up with the International Classification for Diseases. It has all the billing codes, all that stuff. But the part that's most relevant with the DSM is that it's going to give you the criteria needed to make the diagnosis. And you'll see some examples of that in the next video, which will be up shortly, over depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorders. It'll say if you're considering, let's say, bipolar 1 disorder, here's what you need. Here are the ingredients that you need to make that diagnosis. And so it has a list of criteria, as well as here are the threshold. Here's what, when we say cries a lot, this is what we mean. That symptom has to be present for X amount of time. And here are some things to also consider. And then it'll give a brief summary of what these disorders are, what's the prognosis, environmental factors, things like that. And so that's kind of how each diagnosis works, but I'll show a video on how to kind of dissect those diagnoses. So we got to start first with what is a mental disorder, right? And the easiest way to think of a mental disorder is it is a collection of symptoms. It's a constellation, right? That's what these diagnoses are. Just kind of like when you look at the stars in the sky and you kind of look at a certain combination in a certain shape, you start to see things like the Big Dipper, for example. With this, we don't ever focus on just one symptom. It's a cluster of symptoms. It's a bunch of symptoms in combination over a period of time that causes a problem in the person's life, right? So when we talk about the diagnoses, we really advocate, especially in our program and in our field, using people-first language. And you can see the Snow article that's on Blackboard. Rather than saying things like my schizophrenic client or my alcoholic client, it's my client with alcohol use disorder, my client with schizophrenia. And so this is one of the drawbacks of diagnosis, right? That a person feels that they are labeled solely as their diagnosis, and we want to avoid them. For that client, based on what I said, they have multiple symptoms, they've had them for a while, they're causing some distress in their life, they're already wrapped up thinking about this problem, and so we certainly don't want to add to it by saying they have like this scarlet letter on them of their mental illness. So this is, at first glance, this is going to seem dated. The DSM-4 had what's called an axis system, and some of you may be familiar with it. So the axis system is no longer used. You might be asking, so then why are we going over it? The reason I'm going over it is because I've seen a number of interns and graduates go for interviews, and the place that they're applying at is currently still using those axis systems. So it's one of those things that I'd rather you know it and not need it than need it and not know it, right? So on axis 1, we have all the disorders, right? So we're talking about how you would write this down in your notes. We would have one line, axis 1, that's all the disorders except for personality disorders and intellectual disability, what used to be called mental retardation. Axis 2 would be your personality disorders and intellectual disability. Axis 3 is any medical conditions that you want to consider. Axis 4 is all the life stuff, right? Divorce, death, moving, being laid off, things like that. And Axis 5 was an attempt at assigning a number to a person's level of functioning, right? So they called it the Global Assessment of Functioning. So when we look at this, Axis 1 is any of the disorders, right, except for personality and intellectual disability. So if you were to diagnose somebody with anorexia or alcohol dependency or bipolar 2 disorder, that's where it would go. And you would just write it on this line, right? You would just say major depressive disorder, binge eating disorder. And that would be it. And that's where you would most likely put most of your diagnoses. Here's an example, right? So someone can come in, and if they had multiple diagnoses, you would list all of them. So on Axis 1, we see that this client would have alcohol withdrawal, alcohol dependence, and bipolar 1, right? And so we would list them in order of importance, like what is the most current set of symptoms? What is the focus on right now? So this might be someone who they're hospitalized, they were a very heavy drinker, and they have the very severe withdrawal symptoms. So that's what we got to focus on first, followed by the dependence, followed by the bipolar. Here's just a second example. So I won't go through each of these, but just to make sure everybody gets the point, Axis 1 is all disorders except personality and intellectual disability. So this is really important for you to know. You've really got to start to wrap your head around this. We could look at the DSM. Go ahead if you have yours, open it up to any diagnosis. Look at it, and I promise you, chances are you could fit someone in your life into that diagnosis, right? Just because the DSM says that these are the criteria and the person meets the criteria does not mean that you need to diagnose them, right? It's the other way around. If you want to diagnose somebody with a disorder, then they have to meet all those criteria. In other words, the diagnosis is decided by you, right? So otherwise we'd all have every disorder, right? They're all sort of nebulous enough, they're broad enough that we can all look at it and say, hey, that's me, right? Or that's my spouse, or that's my neighbor, or that's my kid, right? And so just because the criteria has been experienced does not automatically mean there's a diagnosis to be made, right? So think about, for example, if someone is grieving, they had a death in the family, chances are they're going to meet all the criteria for depression. However, we don't diagnose depression because someone's going through the normal expected grieving process, right? That's why I go back to it has to be prolonged over time and cause interference, and not because of some other explanation. So again, when you look at the DSM and you look at the criteria and you're looking at your client, don't just diagnose them because you can, right? Look and say, hey, I think these symptoms have been here long enough and they've caused enough of an impact on this person's life that I really think we're dealing with a diagnosis. Then you go to the DSM and say, okay, which of these best describes what my client is going through? Axis 2, your personality disorders and intellectual disability. They just kind of separated those out. And again, this system is no longer used, but in the event that you went for an interview and you're asked questions about an axis, or they give you a chart or a set of notes to look at. This way you at least understand. And I'll post an example of what these look like. So all your personality disorders. Axis 3 was for medical conditions, right? Because some medical conditions can lead to or heighten the symptoms that a client might have, right? So thyroid issues can lead to mood disorders. Certain cancers or infections can lead to the neurocognitive disorders, right? So these are things that we would list. They are of note, in other words. You're obviously not treating or diagnosing a medical condition. So this is when that person comes in and says, I have a history of X, Y, and Z. You're writing this down in your notes simply so you know to keep that in mind. That doesn't mean that you're treating them for that condition. So a couple examples: an infection, hormone issues, diseases, ailments, etc. Axis 4, very important, right? This is all the psychosocial stuff. So moved, survivor of domestic violence, survivor of a natural disaster, adoption, runaway, things like that. So these are all events that we should focus on, right? They are of clinical importance, right? And so what rises up to that threshold of clinical importance? Well, that's what you work on with your client, right? For some people, a thing happens and they're okay with it. It's not an issue. Other times it is. So what you're trying to figure out is this something we need to focus on? And if the answer is yes, then go ahead and write this down. So again, some examples: job problems, housing problems, support group problems. And the global assessment of functioning. So this thing didn't work out the way it was intended. This was, imagine I told you to assign your family member a number that represented their level of functioning. And what number would you give them? Now, chances are most of you would, like, all jokes aside, because some people will say that this person's perfect or this person isn't. Eventually you'd say, well, some days they're this number and it's quite high, and other days they're this number and it's quite low, right? And that was the issue with this, is that you're asking me to give my client a number of functioning, but the first day you ever meet a client, they're probably not feeling real hot, right? They've decided to make a counseling appointment, but then the next week or in a month, that number could change. And so the idea was, we'll assign this snapshot of a number, and over time we'd see the number go up. So even when we were using this, it didn't really work out, I think, the way it was intended. But again, in case it's ever asked, what is GAF or what is Axis 5, it's the global assessment of functioning, which was a number that clinicians would give their clients to represent how functioning the client is. So now I'm going to segue into how we use the DSM and how we start collecting information on our clients. So these are some basic principles. Family history, right? It helps guide and inform, but just because a family member suffered from a mental illness or had a diagnosis, it's not a foregone conclusion that your client will have it, but it is good information to have regardless. And yes, I absolutely, there are some disorders that there's a genetic component, addiction, schizophrenia, right? And it can also be learned stuff, such as if mother had an eating disorder or father had a personality disorder. Those things can lead to similar diagnoses in your client. So good first step to get family history. Physical conditions that can lead to mental health symptoms, and this includes having chronic pain, right? Someone might have suffered an injury from which they still have pain, and that can lead to anxiety, depression, anger, things like that. History beats current appearance, right? Because someone might come in, and it goes the other way too. Someone can have a really, really bad day, and so it looks like these symptoms are all flared up and they have a certain diagnosis, but we're seeing them at their worst, right? Versus all the other parts of their life where they didn't have it. And the opposite, where a person may have had lots of struggles, but today they're doing fine. Just because a person has a good day or even a good week doesn't negate that there might be a diagnosis. And you'll see this come up. So like, for example, let's say with insomnia, right? A person can't sleep and they're trying desperately to sleep. And you ask, well, what's your sleep been like? And they say, well, I slept really well last night. That doesn't erase the previous 50 nights that they couldn't sleep, right? Collateral information. We love collateral information. It's really hard to get, right? Now, if you're working with youth or for school counselors, it's a little bit easier because then you're asking the child, you're asking mom and dad or the caregiver, you're asking teachers, coaches, other people or adults that might supervise the child. But if we can get additional information, that's great. Again, if you can, wonderful. If you can't, that's sort of the norm in my experience. Crisis situations, right? Are the symptoms so severe that maybe hospitalization is required? Now, that only happens for a handful of diagnoses, namely a manic episode with bipolar 1, severe anorexia, the substance use disorders, but being aware of crisis situations, and then that includes suicide and harm to others. Be careful to watch for contradictory information. There's a lot of stigma with what we do, and then when we bring in mental health and symptoms, a client can get even more hesitant to share information. Substance use, right? So this is a question that you should get in the habit of asking at the front end with your clients. Tell me about your drinking and drugging behavior. And this is where hopefully you have a good rapport, you've explained confidentiality and things like that, because substances can mimic a lot of the symptoms of mental illness, right? Or it can make mental illness symptoms even worse or more complicated, but we want to have that information. You don't want to be like a month into working with somebody and then they come in and they say, people were out to get me and I'm super scared and I've got these magical abilities, and now you're left having to, in this very serious conversation, ask, do you use drugs? Do you drink? That'll just immediately shut down your relationship, right? So asking at the front end so you understand what symptoms might be accompanying your client. And with mood disorders, always considered the harm to self, right? Like with severe depression. So the mental status exam. So this is stuff that you'll do with not only at intake, but throughout your time with your client. And so it's probably going to seem like I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. I apologize, but we'll catch up on the finer detail in our Zoom sessions if you have specific questions. But with this, a mental status exam, this is what we're using to collect information to see if our client has any symptoms of any disorder. We started at the intake, and this is where you might have paperwork for your client to fill out that says, check if any of the following are true. I sometimes hear voices that other people can't hear. I have been so sad that I've not gone to work. I have been told that I drink too much. Things like that. So you might do it at that very front end. And then you're going to do it in your conversation with your client. But see here, this third point, it's integrated throughout the counseling process, right? We're going to keep doing it because it's never the expectation that you fully understand and fully know your client by the end of the first session. And from your client's perspective, it's never the expectation that they tell you every detail about themselves to you in that first session, right? They're people, they're living things, they have experiences, and it's going to take time to understand that and to share it. So what is this mental status exam? Here are the pieces of it, and we're going to go through each of them. We have appearance, attitude, and activity, mood and affect, speech and language, thought issues, cognitions, insight and judgment, and impulse control. So starting with appearance, and think of it, because this is going to look like a lot of information at once. What you're doing in your sessions is, if anything stands out about each of these, that's what you're noting, right? If everything looks okay, normal, healthy, whichever word you'd like to use, then you're just kind of moving forward. But appearance, their grooming, their hygiene, cleanliness, the way that they're dressed. For example, if it's 150 degrees outside and the person comes in wearing a sweater and a jacket and is all bundled up, or the reverse, if it's freezing out and the person is wearing very little clothes, do they look disheveled? Do they look dirty? And again, it doesn't automatically mean a diagnosis. What is the issue here? Could it be that there's a socioeconomic issue? Could it be that there was a domestic violence issue? If you see the way they're dressed and it seems odd, is there something cultural going on that you don't understand? Interpersonal, how they interact with you, right? Are they sitting there, arms folded, defensive? Are they cooperative? Are they respectful? Their facial expressions, motor activity, are they snapping? Are they pacing? Are they fidgeting? And their behavior. This is their overt observable behavior. Does it look like they're nervous? Does it look like they're sad? Does it look like they have no energy? So what are they doing? How do they appear in your office? Mood. So how they report being. So when you say, how are you feeling today? And they say, I'm happy, I'm angry, I'm scared. That's their mood. Affect is what you observe, right? So they're saying, I'm happy, I feel great, but they're crying, they're sobbing, their head is down, their voice is low, right? You're observing that. It's affect. And do they match? Speech and language, right? Are they able to articulate? How do they speak? Is it loud, like they're shouting at you? Is it just one monotone voice? Is it vocal fry? Is it pressured? Are they trying to get everything out? Like they've only got seconds to tell you what's happened. How can they express themselves, right? Do they have a hard time? And again, you're looking at this and you're thinking, well, my client is 6. Well, we would expect them to have odd ways of expressing themselves, right? They would have not language issues, but their language would not be fully developed yet. So that's where we might see things like, he hurted me, right? I run to the store, right? Because that's age appropriate. Are they speaking in a native language? Are they explaining something for which there isn't a direct translation? Are there medications involved, right? Things like that. So there's lots of different issues involved, but we want to know if the way they communicate is the same as or close to, similar to same-aged peers. Thought process, content, and perception. So this is where we're kind of getting to the meat, right? We're saying, so tell me about what happened, right? So thought process, how they think, right? Are they bouncing all over the place? Are there weird references, leaps in logic, right? I'm going to fail my class. Well, why are you going to fail your class? Because the teacher didn't call on me when I raised my hand, right? Do they have, do they express like out-of-body experiences, delusions, hallucinations? This is also where you're thinking about suicidal and homicidal thoughts, magical thinking. So think about kids, right? I'm going to jump off the roof and I'm going to be okay because I have superpowers, just like this cartoon I watch. Cognition, how they reason through things, right? And again, this is very age or developmentally dependent. What we're looking at here is compared to same-aged peers, right? So 5-year-olds compared to other 5-year-olds, 30-year-olds compared to other 30-year-olds, are they thinking the same way, right? So general information, do they know who they are, where they are, their attention, can they focus on something, language, memory, things like that. So is there a intellectual impairment? Insight and judgment. The easiest way of thinking about insight and judgment is think of it as maturity, right? So this is very dependent on the person's level of maturity. Insight, awareness of how their own personality traits and behavior contribute to situations, and judgment. Can they make appropriate decisions, right? So, again, everybody makes mistakes. If you make the mistake once, we would expect you not to make it again. If you made it a second time, we would certainly not expect you to make it a third time, right? So are they looking at, was this a good idea or not a good idea? And, of course, that can also be influenced by substances and things like that. I see this a lot when this is low, and again, I've worked with a lot of young adults. It's usually a sign of, immaturity. I'm growing up, and, maybe things are not working out the way it used to before I got to college. Impulse control, right? Can they control themselves? Can they delay gratification? Have they gone into some hot water because they act too impulsively? And to do all of this, what we're doing is we have to establish trust and rapport, just like you have heard 100 times already, establishing that, because some of these questions you're asking, they might be hesitant to answer, or they might become really suspicious or guarded, right? So that's where you're relying on your basic attending skills, reflections and paraphrasing and things like that, knowing a way to kind of communicate with a person with sensitive information, listening to them carefully and empathically, right? Letting them tell their experience, and you asking questions to help understand them better, not pressuring them, easing off when you need to ease off, and moving forward when you need to move forward. And so it takes time, but rapport will go a long way with being able to ask some of the harder questions. But a lot of this stuff is stuff that comes up as you get to know your client in the normal development of your counseling relationship. And here's a couple examples that you can look at. The Sarabia Center, where everybody will do their practicum. There are these really great worksheets that you're going to go through, and then eventually it becomes very automatic. You know what to look for. And again, when everything's okay, that's fine, right? We're not having to go through each of these and say appearance is fine, activity is fine, attention is fine, cognition is fine. Instead, it's when stuff stands out that we're saying this was notable, there was something with this. So let me switch back here. So I know that was a lot of information. Please let me know if this is too disjointed, if I'm going too quickly, if you need more information. I'm adjusting to this as well, so any of that feedback is absolutely welcome. I look forward to talking to you guys soon and hearing what you'd like to get out of the semester. That's going to do it for tonight. That's quite a bit. I hope it was helpful. If I can provide more information or clarify anything, all you got to do is let me know, and I will talk to you again soon.